Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Elle. Sexuality and the complications with human sexuality have always been something that cinema has barely sort of talked about in a lot of ways, and certainly in terms of all the complications that happen within it. Certainly there's pornography and movies of just people straight fucking and stuff, but Elle is talking about a kind of sexuality in a more complicated way than we're really used to from most movies. Now, it's not really certainly saying something about feminism. It's not saying something about rape in the general sense. It's kind of a character study of a very interesting character named Michelle, played by Isabelle Huppert, very excellently by Isabelle Huppert, and how she dealt with this current situation, how she manipulated the situation, how she went through all of this. But it's not necessarily a statement about any of that, which could be more complicated and problematic for some people, made in an analytical way, but having that dark humor that Paul Verhoeven's known for. Elle is the kind of movie that it'll turn off a lot of people, and I imagine people who are more PC minded and following rules in a very strict sense won't really like it. But I think Elle's a much more interesting movie than that. If we're going to have all these ideas about openness of sexuality, a film like Elle should probably be judged in a much more open-minded way. It's just a lot more difficult and made by someone who doesn't really care if it is difficult, presenting it in a different kind of odd way that can be perceived as something that could be borderline offensive and insensitive, when in fact that's really not ultimately what it's trying to say with its lead character. Elle is a kind of psychological thriller that goes into the psyche of someone who has a unique psyche and a unique view on sexuality, and going into that kind of a thriller involving rape puts Elle in kind of a class amongst itself, but brings back Paul Verhoeven after 10 years and shows the kind of interesting wit that he's known for, and the interesting way he takes on sexuality and characters to really present you one of the more interesting and more adult thrillers that I've seen in a long time, that really takes on adult themes about sexuality, which also makes you laugh with his trademark satirical edge. Elle is the kind of thriller that you thought would maybe evolve with you as you got older, and most people aren't grown up enough to take, but Elle is the kind of movie that's going to do what it's going to do whether you like it or not. Elle starts off with a rape and goes from there. Literally the first scene is having someone break into her home, raping her, and then right after and he leaves, she decides to order sushi, have a bubble bath, and doesn't really tell anyone until a casual dinner. It's a movie that you're kind of just surprised by. There's certainly rape revenge films. Miss 45 is an excellent one, but what Elle does in this is quite intriguing, because as you see, she runs a video game company that's very successful. You see her think this guy could have been the masked person who came and raped her, trying to get over the trauma as her heightened sense of what actually happened to her and how she deals with it, and ends up twisting the perception of how she's supposed to behave, I guess, and who actually did this to her and why, and what kind of a power move it actually was. This is the first film from Paul Verhoeven, who hasn't made a Hollywood film in a long time, but it's his first film in 10 years. Paul Verhoeven's kind of a favorite of mine, having done RoboCop, Starship Troopers, Total Recall, and many others. This isn't really, I think, in the vein of those films, although the humor is definitely there from those films. I guess you could compare it to more of his films about sexuality. I don't know many of his Dutch films, unfortunately, or any of them really, but I guess this would be a semi more comparable in that there's sex in it to his film Basic Instinct. What Verhoeven does is he at first plays on the melodrama and kind of can go over the top in certain situations in this film, and use that very well, and particularly the overscoring. That this and Basic Instinct kind of remind you of Hitchcock, but in that 90s way they're trying to take on and be very influenced by Hitchcock in the overscoring of Bernard Herrmann. He uses it very well in this as kind of a way to heighten the paranoia that she really has after the sexual assault, and how if you've ever been assaulted or mugged or something, right after you're just on edge and you're not really sure who to trust, and you're just afraid of your own shadow and what corner to go around. And this character certainly isn't doing that necessarily, but she's still like shooken up, and it gives that sense to it. A lot of the time, since you're seeing this mainly from her perspective, you're really seeing things from her perspective and her mood at the time, which Verhoeven does very well with a lot of the music, which was by Anne Dudley, which kind of reminds me of Bernard Herrmann in certain senses. But he doesn't do the ridiculous sexuality of Basic Instinct or Showgirls. This is more kind of real and shot in kind of like in a way that it's directed and you could observe it if you don't know him as well, that he's directing it from a distance, from a remove of what's going on. But you know he's doing that on purpose to kind of let you see what's going on, but not point you in a moral direction, which is interesting. It kind of reminds me of what Hollywood directors would do almost with women's pictures. They wouldn't be as moralistic until later as Hollywood got the code and became a tad less interesting. In Elle, they don't have that judgment. Elle is just shown to be a really awesome character. Michelle, or Elle, played by Isabelle, Huppert, is just shown to, despite the patriarchy, despite everything that's going on in her life and everyone that's trying to make her into a certain person, which has been her entire life, you see her as kind of defiant in all that. You feel like she's defiant and against and different and misunderstood, but able to climb up through society. And I think it's amazing because I think so much of what I love about certain Verhoeven movies is these protagonists who keep marching, soldiering on through their own kind of beliefs, particularly Total Recall and RoboCop. And this film, Elle, does that as well, but in kind of a character who's doing that in their own kind of weird, strange perspective. It's a character study of someone who is very unique. You learn about how her father was one of the biggest serial killers in French history and how many people feel that she may have done it or she was more involved than she really was. There's all sorts of weird cinephile theories that maybe she did kill them and all this stuff. I don't really know. I don't actually think she did. I think she was kind of a witness. She might know more and so forth, but it was also because it was her dad. Seeing how this unique perspective deals with something like rape and how someone who was raped is kind of the idea that they're supposed to act in a certain way, which I don't think this film does at all, and I don't think this character would do at all. And it kind of is showing what this certain character would do in that circumstance, which is kind of very interesting. I think a lot of the controversy over this is our views on sexuality and rape and how it's always treated in this one way. And certainly every person is different, and I think every person's sexuality should be treated as different. I'm not saying I subscribe to every idea of various things about gender and things like that, but I think that everyone treats these things very differently, and acting like everyone should act a certain way, and that the way this character acts is right for this character and this person, but is not right for everyone, and maybe generally people act a certain way. But I think what this is asking you to do is having more of an open mind about all these certain things. And it's kind of an interesting hybrid of a lot of things, as Paul Verhoeven is Dutch. This film was written by an American and then translated into French, and it's kind of an odd kind of mishmash of a lot of things. It feels European, but it also feels satirical in that kind of fuck you, how is Verhoeven getting away with this Hollywood way that I kind of miss from him and his Hollywood films. I miss Verhoeven, I love Verhoeven, and I love how satirical and dark this could take on certain things. You know, Verhoeven doesn't really know French, and it was hard for him to communicate with his crew, but it felt like a challenge, and this does feel like kind of a challenging, interesting film from him. It doesn't feel like an easy home run that you expect from late directors. It feels like more of an interesting, thoughtful conversation that you'd never expect from an older man to really give you, and you wish they would do more of, and that's really what I like about this film. I think it shows an auteur working at their highest level and trying to challenge themselves. I mean, even without him, you know, saying that in interviews, I really believe it when I was watching it. I was like, this is kind of an interesting way to do it, because it's not a retread of these sexual thrillers of the 80s like Fatal Attraction or something. It's not a retread of Basic Instinct. It's kind of like he's doing a completely unique kind of a film and a unique take on sexuality and rape, which is something I really wasn't expecting at this time. It's kind of interesting that I think some of the more interesting films of this year, like this and Moonlight, take on sexuality in more of an interesting way and show how it can kind of shape the person you are and how past experiences can shape the person you are and your sexuality and how that changes. And I think that's very much in this as well. Isabelle Huppert is really amazing in this. This is really kind of one of the star performances. It's the kind of performance so strong that it's usually in a weaker movie that elevates it to be way better than it really should be treated as in most people's eyes, like, you know, like Dallas Buyers Club or something like that, where you're like, this movie's like, but the performance is amazing. I love this movie. This performance, it's like almost like too good. It's so amazing. I really love her in this. Heard people say like, how come her and Verhoeven just made a movie now? Because I would love to see her be the star of tons of Paul Verhoeven movies. I don't think Paul Verhoeven would do that. He's not someone to make the same type of movie, but I think her performance in this kind of just like makes this movie. You don't even really think about anyone else who's in the film. In fact, I don't really care as much about them, although I think they kind of bring out the film in certain ways, particularly like her idiot son, her best friend's husband, husband who she's having an affair with, all this nonsense. I mean, she's a really interesting, complex kind of a character who both a victim of rape and a victim of violence, and is marginalized by all these guys, but then runs a video game company where she uses this kind of patriarchal view of sexuality and female sexuality to sell video games, but also like hates that in real life. It's kind of, she's a very interesting character, and Isabelle Huppert plays it in such an amazing, wonderful way. It's probably one of my favorite performances. One of those where I'm like, I kind of want to see more movies with her. Is she like this in all these movies? Apparently I have seen her in things like I Heart Huckabees, and she was even in Heaven's Gate and things like that, but I feel like I've been missing out on one of our great actors or something after this kind of a performance. She was just probably one of my favorite performances of the whole year. Just real star kind of a role, and I think it shows how well Verhoeven works with a lead actor. When you think of the people who are real leads in his film, you're always just so with the protagonist, you're so with them, and he kind of twists that and uses it in such a dark, weird way, and Isabelle Huppert feels like she's so game for it. It makes it even more kind of like an interesting, twisty road to go down within Elle, really. As much as I'm talking about how odd and various views of sexuality and perspectives of rape and things that this film puts forth during its runtime, I think Elle is actually a fairly interesting, entertaining, kind of very cinephile, bizarre kind of film that you're not really expecting at this time, but that kind of what makes it so wonderful. And it shows how interesting and challenging a Paul Verhoeven film can be and still be very funny. I mean, it's still a really funny, interesting, black humor kind of a film, and he still manages to say all these complex themes throughout it. That's always been the genius of Verhoeven. You think it's a dumb movie like Starship Troopers, and then you end up saying things about fascism in America. And I think Elle is the same way, but what it says about both sexuality and going down a character piece of a very odd, cold, kind of defiant character like Michelle is almost perfect for someone like Verhoeven that always has kind of more loaded themes throughout his films than you really expect them to. In this, it's like he's almost playing with a kind of film that, you know, you expect kind of a foreign film to have all these interesting ideas throughout it, and he's even playing with things with class and privilege, our perception of women in the workplace, or a perception of an older woman running a video game company and her life and how she's viewed in general, to really say kind of interesting things throughout it. I think it's probably one of the more interesting late director films I've seen in a long time, and a late director who's actually challenging themselves, not just doing the kind of automatic thing just so they can do it, which often they feel like they can. It gives you kind of more respect for Paul Verhoeven, because you wouldn't think he'd make an interesting and troubling and difficult art movie and also make it entertaining at the same time. But that's kind of been Verhoeven's whole bag this whole time. One of the more interesting psychological thrillers, and one that actually makes you think about a lot of things, doesn't just make you think the person's a serial killer or something like that. It shows a director that instead of getting bored and complaining about how they make too many superhero movies, actually made an interesting, thought-provoking kind of a movie that wasn't something people were asking for, and is something that most people would probably find difficult, especially at a time like this. But Elle kind of doesn't really care about any of that. It's just going to exist and, like its main character, be what it's going to be, and you're going to deal with it or you're not, but it's still going to be what it is. And I think that's one of the most wonderful things about this movie, and kind of its uniqueness. And that's something I always like about going to the movies and seeing kind of a unique, different take on something. But I think Elle pushes that to degrees that I didn't think was really possible, even possible for Verhoeven at this point. It's an interesting, dark, psychological thriller that doesn't really care if you get exactly what it's doing or not, but it's just going to do it, and you're going to either have to deal with it or be disgusted. But either way, this movie doesn't really care, and maybe that's what's so awesome about it. So if you have seen Elle and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.